That and the 42%.
The 42% was also like, hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mental Health Much, the podcast that talks about everything queer and mental health. Thank you, Jordan, for helping me with the intro.
You're welcome, Vincent.
Double surprise, Jordan. We said it was the conclusion last time.
But it isn't. It never ends.
It never ends. And not only are we adding an extra episode, this one is recorded.
It's on YouTube. It's going to be a video extravaganza.
Yes. So if you are listening through the podcast app, like you normally do, and you don't want to see our face, keep doing what you're doing.
Who doesn't want to see our faces? We are more beautiful and stunning in person than you could even imagine from our voices on the podcast.
Anyway, there will be a link in the description to go to the YouTube freshly Mental Health Much YouTube channel that for now has one video, which is this one. And if you are discovering us through YouTube, this is, I think, episode 56 of Mental Health Much. So if you like what you're hearing, you have a whole catalog with no image that you can go back to on any app where you listen to podcasts. We'll see how often we do this, because we'll see how long it takes me to edit this thing and how awkward we look on camera.
We don't look awkward. We're natural. We're naturals with the camera. It's loving us. And we're loving it.
Jordan, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. I'm so
course.
excited to be here.
Let's start with our usual thanking people who gave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you. It's only one person since we aired the conclusion from the show. I was hesitant to read this person's username because it really looks like a phone number because it's 10 digits. But I looked it up and it doesn't seem to be a phone number. So thank you to 122-323-9494. Is it a joke that I'm not getting?
I don't think so.
I tried reading it in French to see if it was reminding me of something.
Did you try and call him?
No, I didn't try to call it. I just Googled it and it's not.
If I pick up, don't be surprised.
Well, thank you for the nice review. It was actually really kind. Jordan, what are we talking about today?
We're going to be talking about eating disorders and queer culture.
This is part of a whole season that we have just on body image in the queer culture. Mm-hmm. And I think eating disordered and disordered eating is just a thing that's been in the background our whole season. And we decided to do an extra episode and to record it because why not?
Why not?
To talk about this. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a heavy topic to start with. So if people are just finding about us on YouTube, this is a heavy topic to start with. But we wanted to talk about it, and I think it's really important, and we wanted to make it relevant with the queer culture, of course. Trigger warning, we will talk about BMI and calorie counting and, some behaviors that may affect you. So we don't normally do trigger warnings on Mental Health Much, but I think for this one, I just wanted to put it out there.
It's important. Yeah.
To structure our episode today, we'll start by talking about what you know about eating disorder, which is kind of the way that it's represented on media. And then after that, I'll give some definitions. After that, we'll talk about all the queer specific stuff because it affects different population differently. And then at the end, of course, we'll have some treatment and recommendations because we cannot just open that box and leave nothing. Mm-hmm. So, Jordan, how much do you know about eating disorders?
Well, Vincent, I don't actually know an awful lot, to be quite honest, other than what I researched for today's podcast. I am a bit ignorant to the diversity of eating disorders, and I only kind of know what I picked up from popular culture, to be quite honest. Would you like me to share with the audience what that is?
Yeah.
So,
go ahead. Tell us what you picked up from media.
So before this podcast,
because you read our notes a little bit, so you cheated a little bit.
I did cheat a little bit, but going into this, I think the only experience I knew of, I only knew about bulimia and anorexia nervosa. Anorexia I knew because of, this is dating me because I'm older than Vincent. It doesn't look it, but I am. Through Karen Carpenter, the Carpenters. Do you know that musical group?
No.
They sang Close to You, Yesterday Once More. They were big in the 70s.
Okay.
Back before Vincent was born.
Let's move on.
Let's move on. But Karen Carpenter was a very famous singer. She died of anorexia. She was extremely thin, and I just remember seeing her images of her, and that's the association I had with eating disorders. It was primarily like always presented to me in school or in any place that you heard about it as being women, especially young girls who were white and thin and middle class, and it was about attaining this unrealistic beauty standard, and they just couldn't be beautiful enough and thin enough, and they starved themselves to death. And that is what I understood about eating disorders. Bulimia came a little bit later. I think talk shows probably I was exposed to some of that stuff, but I really didn't learn a lot, and it was all very centered on a white female narrative.
Yeah. Do you have an instinct of what's the difference between anorexia and bulimia?
So anorexia is the obsession with like being thin and starvation. There's a starvation component to it. Bulimia has a binge and a purge aspect to it, from what I understood. There was like an eating piece, and then there's a purging, and that could be like vomiting, that could be like laxatives and whatnot, and that's really where it ended before reading about some of this stuff. But
it's somewhat right, but we'll definitely give you more
I'm gonna get
details. Yeah. There's a lot more into there, but this is, I think, the definition that most people who have not spent 9 pages researching this or are not therapists would tell you. For me in the media, I agree with you that it's always women, always women. It's always young. They're always white. They're always extremely attractive. And then there's either 2 ways of presenting this, which I call either like the tragic way or the comedic way. So the tragic way, again, it's always a girl. She's always already very skinny and very attractive. And then depending on how tragic you do, there's like this trauma porn idea of like showing someone who's very, very skinny, or they're just conventionally skinny woman. My best example that I have for the tragic one is from Glee.
Glee of all places.
Yes. Her name is Marley. She's already like very skinny, very pretty. And it's somebody like teaching her how to make herself like vomit. I feel like when it's tragic, vomiting is often involved. It's rare that on media and TV show they show someone who's like playing with their food and not eating. It's mostly like the purging aspect I find on media.
Yeah.
That's big because it's much more
dramatic.
Yeah, dramatic or like visual. And then there's the whole like comedic side that we see in Mean Girls with Regina, or in The Devil Wear Prada.
Yes.
With what's her name, Emily, and it's always played for fun. It's always, again, white, very attractive, very like thin woman who then just make jokes about like, is butter a carb? Or in The Devil Wear Pradas, it's like, I think she says something in the realm of like, I'm on this new diet. I don't eat anything until I think I'm gonna faint, and then I eat 1 cube of cheese.
Yeah, I remember that line. Well, it's all about like the food they're not eating.
Yeah. They're portrayed as like being vain and being superficial, and literally like them having an eating disorder or disordered eating is just like haha part of like their character. It's funny.
Yeah.
Another trope that I see in the media, you've probably seen this one, is the before and after.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
No. Tell me more.
The before and after is like they have a character, and the main thing that I have in my head, and I can't remember her name because I've only watched a few episodes of this, but was in Pretty Little Liars.
Okay.
Did you watch this?
No, I've never seen any of the shows I've watched. I just don't watch TV, which makes me a bad co-host.
One of the characters is always talked about as she was fat in the past, and now she's skinny because she doesn't eat. In Pretty Little Liar, they didn't use a fat suit for the previous one, so it's just the same skinny girl in like larger baggy clothes.
Oh.
Because there's a lot of flashbacks in that particular show, which I guess like good for the show not to use a fat suit, but it also like gives this idea that like if you're still fat, it's because you have not, like this character, discovered how.
Yeah, it's not presented as a bad thing.
Yeah. No, it's good because now she's skinny and she's pretty and she's beautiful.
And happy.
Yeah.
Probably happy too.
Yeah. No, nobody's really happy in that show.
I'm going to throw you a curveball because there's another thing that I came up with researching with media was this. Have you ever seen the movie To the Bone? I think it's on Netflix. It's a portrayal of a woman going to an eating disorder clinic.
Oh.
And the actress that they hired actually had an eating disorder. She fits all the tropes. She's very thin, beautiful, model-like. Even her makeup is done like she's got sunken eyes, but it looks kind of glamorous. But like she's actually in this film portraying somebody trying to lose weight, which I can't believe you would do that with somebody who had eating disorder.
I guess like it's important to talk about it,
Yeah.
and I haven't seen that, so I don't know if it's well done.
It's not well done from what I
Okay.
can see. There was a lot of flack from it, and a lot of people who criticized the use of an actress who had an eating disorder, and it was portraying a lot of tropes about like a magical like male doctor saves her from an eating disorder, and all the women in the clinic with her were also young white women, except there was one man.
Ooh,
And so
diversity.
right? And like this idea that like it was all because of they couldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy and the images in the magazine they were susceptible to, which is a lot of people say that that's not necessarily what anorexia is all about. It's not about you being like just vulnerable to seeing an image and being like, oh, I want to be that thin. There's more complexity to it, and it didn't really get to that. So a lot of really one-note kind of portrayals of eating disorders in the media.
So it's already like pretty obvious to see the flaws in the way it's represented in the media, that you have to be skinny, that you have to be a woman, that you have to be white. I mean, maybe it has changed, but like, I don't think I've ever seen a not white person with an eating disorder on the show.
Yeah, I mean, it goes in the face of a lot of other cultural stereotypes we have about other people's bodies, right? Like,
Yeah. And in the case of Pretty Little Liar, it almost like then they introduce 4 characters, and like one has sex with her teacher, and one is a closeted lesbian. I can't remember what the other one does. And then one has an eating disorder. Like, this is now her personality, which...
personality is eating disorder.
Yeah, as you think, you used to be fat, but you were not really. It's also so irking that they hire naturally skinny people to play people with eating disorder. That has worked.
Like, I learned from a little bit of the research I did that eating disorders are a part of the puzzle. They can be a manifestation of other mental health issues like PTSD, like depression. Like, there's more to it than that. Like, a woman's life is not defined by her pursuit of thinness, or and yet we're reduced to these tropes. It's really dehumanizing. Right?
Yeah.
And the lack of visibility for men is incredibly troubling to me, because of the 30 million diagnosed eating disorders that there are out there, 10 million of those are for men. So 1 in 3 eating disorders are affecting a man. So why is there zero visibility for men in that sort of media portrayal?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't be gay and have an eating disorder at the same time, and both things can be issues in your life. It's possible.
So you talked about bulimia and anorexia. The first one that I can give a definition for is anorexia, which in the DSM is actually called anorexia nervosa. I think I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
One of the conditions for anorexia, like you mentioned, is that you limit your intakes of calories. So you just sort of like don't eat a lot of food. And to be diagnosed with anorexia, it has to be in the fear of gaining weight.
So, like, when you think about anorexia, when I think about it, I think about the woman who has the distorted image of herself in the mirror. Like, she looks fine to everybody else, but in the mirror, she sees somebody who's overweight. That kind of,
Yeah.
that's distorted mental lens.
I don't know if this truly happens to people, but yes, to be diagnosed, you need like a fear of gaining weight and a disturbance in the way you see your body. Bulimia, which is bulimia nervosa in the DSM, normally includes like binges and purges, and it needs to like happen like once a week for at least 3 months or something like that. What's really interesting with anorexia is that in order to get a diagnosis, the actions are not enough. You also need to have a certain body type. If these actions, and I'm quoting from the DSM, lead to a very low body weight. So there are no numbers in the DSM. So it's kind of up to the doctor or the psychiatrist who would make the diagnosis if they think that you appear like you have a low enough body weight.
That's kind of problematic, isn't it?
It is kind of. That means that anybody, like I could have never got diagnosed with anorexia.
You could have had the fear of like gaining weight.
Yeah, I could and I've had like moments in my life where I did not eat. I've had moments with binges, but I've had moments of just like restriction, and I was too heavy to be diagnosed with anorexia. Like nobody would have seen me and think, oh, this person is like in a very low body weight.
It also seems really irresponsible to let somebody get to such a low body weight that they're going to have other health implications from that. Because from what I understand, a lot of stuff happens in your body when
Yeah.
you're that thin that is not good for you.
Yeah.
So it just seems a little bit dodgy.
Yeah.
No offense to the medical profession, but
For bulimia, there are no body shapes that are needed. Like bulimia is much more behavior, like you said, and it's kind of good that it exists because some people have bulimia, like you said. I think body stuff is almost always there, but some people have the behavior not always to lose weight. There's a big thing about controlling controlling food intake when people have PTSD, when people have multiple trauma, when people are in a situation where they feel they have no control over their life. Often, like, the behaviors get worse.
so it would be more like subconsciously I might be trying to get control in my life, but I'll filter that through and think it's about the food, about the eating. It's more of a subconscious motivation.
Yeah, or like I think when a lot of people feel like they have no control over their life, they start thinking about weight, and then it's like, this is one thing I can control. So bulimia has binging and purging. Like you said, you kind of need both to have bulimia. Like purging and binging are their own eating disorder as well when you have just the one and not the other one. And then it's weird because purging can also be very much at the discretion of somebody who diagnoses. Like most people, when they think of purging, they really think about vomiting, but laxative and other medication, extreme exercise, or even fasting is a way of purging. So if I feel like I've eaten too much today, so I'm going to fast for the next day, that would be considered like a way of purging.
And you can kind of hide that behind like a guise of like, I'm just fasting for like, cleanses, right? Like there's a lot of that stuff you can hide, I think, from people.
What's the most weird that really annoys me is that there are actually two types of anorexia. Like I'm going back to anorexia and like the need for the body type to have anorexia. There are two types. There is a restricting food type, and there is a binging and purging type of anorexia.
I am so confused.
So if you're really skinny, you are diagnosed with anorexia.
Right.
And if you're not, I guess, really skinny, it's kind of like almost like everyone else as bulimia. And now things have changed in the DSM-5 where you can be diagnosed with anorexia if you are bigger, if you're not skinny, but you would be diagnosed with quote-unquote abnormal anorexia.
Oh, versus normal anorexia.
Yeah, well, there's just the anorexia and there's the abnormal type. Sorry, I said abnormal. It's atypical anorexia.
I take that back. Atypical anorexia.
Yeah. So you either have the typical anorexia because you appear to be small, or if you are really just not eating and the doctors could not understand why you're not just skin and bones, you would have atypical anorexia.
So you're a failure at anorexia if you don't lose weight.
So I wrote 3 ways in which this really annoys me. Do you have any ways in which this annoys you?
I'm just discovering my annoyance about it right now. So
you haven't like made your annoyance in 3 distinct categories.
I generalized annoyance disorder with this.
You will notice that these are very much influenced by anti-fat bias and the diet culture. So the first, it kind of implies, like you said, that if you restrict food successfully, you will always have an extremely low, like small body as a result, right? And if you do it and somehow you're not skinny, it's atypical.
Yeah. What's wrong with you?
Right. Which we know this is not how the body works. After losing a certain amount of weight, the body resists to eating. There are a lot of people out there, and I think I put myself in this category, of people who will not ever reach the point where they could technically get a diagnosis, which really irks me. Like I could have the behavior, but not get the diagnosis and not necessarily get the treatment or people believing me. And that is really aligned with diet culture, who keeps telling us that if you restrict your calorie, you're going to lose weight. Like that A equals B in all case, every case, for everyone.
If
Right.
not, it's a failure on your part.
Or you're atypical.
You're
Yes,
atypical.
exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
I just find that preposterous that they don't make this behavior based. Like, just keep it behavioral based. If I've got the behaviors, then I have an anorexia. It's not atypical. And like, why should you have to demonstrate that you can see all of your ribs before you know getting a diagnosis? That's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
We're calling it the DSM.
The second thing that I don't like, that is more sort of like complicated maybe, is that for me it implies that if you have an eating disorder and you're still fat, that you're doing it wrong. It must be because you're binging. 'Cause like there's this idea that if you are fat, then you have bulimia because of course you're fat. So there's no way you're good at restricting your food. You must be one of the person that binges. Like, does it make sense that I think this way?
And what you're saying makes sense in that it's crazy. Like, in terms of like the way that it's setting people up for like, you're not successful at like binging and purging. Like, these are unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah.
Mind-boggling.
And because of that, I have heard that comes from Maintenance Phase, the podcast. I tried to Google that information, but I couldn't find it myself, which doesn't mean that it's not true. But they were saying that it takes on average 11 years for a person who's fat to get a diagnosis of an eating disorder.
That's a long time to be damaging your body through
Yeah.
a restrictive diet or through binging and purging or whatever you're doing. That's a really long time to go without a diagnosis. And then if you have any other barrier, I would imagine, like say you're a man, also don't get diagnosed early with anorexia.
Yeah.
More time for you to suffer and experience more difficulties.
Yeah. Or you have a body type that doesn't lose weight a lot. Like actually, there's a ton of people out there who had huge eating disorder or disordered eating behavior and actually lost weight and were just praised for losing weight instead of like people recognizing that like, no, you, in order to function, you need to actually put fuel in your body and that there's no amount of eating disorder that's going to make you reach the point where you're just skinny enough to have anorexia.
Right.
And then the third reason is that a lot of people fall through the cracks. I'm just doing keto, I'm just counting calories, then they're not going to be diagnosed.
They're just on a diet.
Yeah, exactly. And it just kind of like the line between dieting is good because not being fat is good and now you're going too much and you have a problem are literally like, do you look so skinny that it's people are not comfortable with the way you look? Or do you purge in a way that it makes people uncomfortable the way you purge? Otherwise, you're on a diet and it's kind of fine. Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense. There's another arbitrary line in the sand about where like a behavior is like socially acceptable. Like, and diets also have the benefit, as we talked about with diet culture, of being scientific or like having that illusion of science. Though many of these diets could be leading to anorexic behaviors. Like that to me feels very arbitrary. It's the point where other people are judging you or perceiving you. That's what's going to be the deciding factor.
Yeah.
Like if I can see your bones and that makes me uncomfortable, then you're saying you're anorexic.
Exactly. Like if the way you look makes me feel uncomfortable, then you have anorexia.
Oh.
Even the way you purge, we're going to talk about queer stuff, but like in gay men stuff, if you purge with 2 hours at the gym, most people are going to be praising you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, I ate 4 donuts yesterday. I did not actually. What a missed opportunity.
I ate 6 donuts yesterday, and I'm not lying. I ate 6 donuts.
Oh, you had a
And it
better
was
life
so
than me.
fucking good.
But then if I go spend 2 hours at the gym, and if I do that once a week for 3 months, then I have what it takes to be diagnosed with bulimia. But will I really get that diagnosis? I'm not sure. It's very tricky that like there's so much that falls in between this line of like I'm on a diet versus I have an eating disorder. And I think this is why, and you've probably heard me throughout the season say disordered eating versus eating disorder. Like when you have an eating disorder is that you've been fully diagnosed with an eating disorder. And then what I call disordered eating is what I think I've had because I've never been diagnosed and I'm not sure how I would fit in those categories. Then you have disordered eating.
Right. There's a lot of parallels with this, and we've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast, with other issues like when say drinking becomes socially unacceptable for people, then they've got an alcohol abuse problem. But as long as they can, not have any consequences of their extreme drinking, then it's fine. these arbitrary lines that are really guided in our
Yeah.
society by other people's opinion are harmful.
Yeah.
I'm not really a big fan right now of this definition of anorexia. It's really bothering me. It's like very harmful if you ask me. But yeah.
In a way, I can understand the needing for having like clear boundaries in order to diagnose someone, but it's also very, very flawed.
Still not great. But
Yeah. Before we move to like the queer stuff, I'm gonna read from my note a little bit because there's like a few eating disorder that I don't want to just bash about. The two that we've talked about, let's go through. So there, binging is an eating disorder on its own. It's eating until feeling uncomfortably full, and it has to cause distress and lack of control, right? So if I go to the restaurant and I ordered a lot of food and I feel gross, I'm not necessarily like binging. So it has to have like a lack of control and has to cause distress, and it depends on context and not just numbers of calorie. And then purging is also a diagnosis on itself, like the opposite of binging. So it's people who purge without having to binge before. There are also 3 eating disorders in the DSM-5 that have nothing to do with weight, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on them. One is avoidant or restrictive food disorder, which is someone who doesn't eat, like anorexia, but it's not motivated by weight loss. It's just people who are like repulsed by food, or they just don't put food in their body. And there are 2 that are called pica and rumination disorder. And the first one is people eating things that are not food. I feel like there's a whole show about people like eating couches and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's pica. And then the second one I didn't know about, and is rumination disorder. And it's people who like regurgitate their food and then like eat it back.
I'm really trying to hide my face.
I know. I don't want to be judgmental, but it is like, it's not necessarily a pretty sight to think about. Anyway, these are not, like, people don't do that in order to lose weight. So,
There's another one I read about that has to do with diabetic and like insulin. There's one that's sort of formulated around people with diabetes controlling their insulin intake because they believed it made them fat. That was but it was not a well-known one.
I wonder if it's like an onset of like anorexia or bulimia that is caused by, like, there's a ton of other condition that affects how people eat food. Some people like cannot eat certain foods, so it really affects their eating. But I didn't find that in the DSM-5 when I researched for this episode.
Okay.
Let's talk about queer stuff.
And it's fitting we're doing this because this is the beginning of Pride Month.
Yes.
Happy Pride to our listeners.
Happy Pride.
So let's talk about getting that pride body.
Yeah.
Which is something I've heard like for a long time. Like, get that pride body. Getting ready for pride means losing weight, exercising, going to the gym excessively. I've never done that. My pride body is the body that I have for the rest of the year. So we're going to talk about things that are queer and gay. So in my research for today's podcast, I focused kind of on that niche. It was a surprise to me to know that about half of the men who are diagnosed with an eating disorder are gay.
Yeah, I saw the stats too. Did you research that stat, or did you just take it for granted?
I did not take it for granted. I double-checked, I fact-checked your stats.
Yeah, and
Fact-checked
you
myself.
fact-checked my fact check?
I was like, just a fact-check
Yeah.
myself. 42% is the number that you saw, as well as the one that I saw.
This number is like everywhere, and it's, if you're doing research at home or you're interested in things and you see a very specific number appear everywhere all the time and not being disputed, be careful about it, because that's weird, because that's not how life works. And this particular 42% number is based on one research dating from 2007
Dated.
that only had 500 participants,
Yeah.
and they were not all men.
Yeah.
So 42%, let's be mindful about it. And then so many research use it. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, so I pulled a lot of the stuff that I researched, as I said to you, from the National Eating Disorder Association, and they talked about 30 million diagnosed eating disorders, which is thought to be underreported to begin with. Like, that number is a lower number than probably exists in real life, because what? There's stigma around eating disorders, and people don't always go and get a diagnosis.
And like, the diagnosis leave a lot of places for falling in the cracks, like we just discussed.
So about 10 million of those are men. Between 1989 and 2009, there was a 53% increase in hospitalization for men from eating disorders, which is a big jump. So there's a belief that men can get an eating disorder, There's that belief in society that men shouldn't be concerned about their body image and we're just going about things, and that's a woman's problem, right? Women have to live up to the expectations of men, so why would men have an eating disorder? Right. When we talk about queer men, it makes a lot of sense, but but there's a lot of heterosexual men out there with eating disorders. In fact, the bulk of all diagnoses are still heterosexual men.
Well, because there's so many of them.
Yeah, compared to us. There's so few gays in the world. But a lot of us have eating disorders, whereas there's so many straight men. There's a double stigma for having an eating disorder. So if you get diagnosed with one, there's a perception that you're less masculine. On the National Eating Disorders website, there's a lot of great blogs and testimonials from people. And a lot of guys said that they were afraid of being diagnosed because it would make them feminine or gay, which it doesn't. But that's a fear for a lot of women, right? So, and then there's a lot of problems with assessment tests being really geared towards women and using language that's only about women and females. So that means a lot of people are going to fall through the cracks and not be able to respond to those.
Also, like BMI is famously trash, but it's also more famously trash for men, especially if they're tall. So like, trash.
Trash.
Yeah.
BMI is trash. We're putting you on blast. So we talked a little bit about like the barriers, I think, to people being diagnosed. We touched on it. And one of the problems is when people wait so long for a diagnosis, they're exposed to a higher chance of mortality or morbidity. Like you can have a diagnosis of an eating disorder along with other mental health issues.
Yeah.
So the big ones are depression,
Anxiety.
What do you think the other two are? And don't look at my notes. Skill testing question 10.
Body dysmorphia.
No.
ADHD.
No.
Trauma.
No.
PTSD. Oh my god,
Okay.
I'm so bad at this.
So the comorbidities, you're right, those are probably on there, but excessive exercise was like an exercise disorder or excessive exercise.
Oh, okay.
And substance use.
Oh,
Which is
I should
mine.
have thought about substance use. Yeah.
You should have.
Yeah.
Thank God I was here to think about substance use. I'm sure there's a trauma piece in there, but from what I could read, there wasn't a lot of talk about trauma
Yeah.
in eating disorders, which I'd like to hear more about. But a lot of facts and figures to throw out, but like gay men were 7 times more likely to report binging and 12 times more likely to report purging than heterosexual men. We had a significantly higher prevalence of lifetime syndrome bulimia, subclinical bulimia, and any subclinical eating disorder. Please don't ask me what subclinical means.
I love that you put stuff on your paper that you
I
don't
don't
know what it
understand.
means. We're
I
just
just wanna
saying
say
it with
smart.
confidence. Yeah.
Subclinical. Do I appear smart? Not now. And like there's an onset for guys who identify as gay or bisexual as teenagers. And this was funny because it made me think of when we talked about the onset of our own relationship with food and body image. They're more likely to be at higher risk of binge eating and purging at that age.
It's funny that even with queer people, the research always focused on teenagers.
Yeah.
That's also because it's easier to make researches in school than in colleges.
Captive
But,
audience.
yeah.
I've been thinking personally back to that though, the connection I made between these stats and like what my own understanding was that like when I was 12 or 13, I first started having problems with my body image because I became aware of like what my peers might think about my body and what like society was telling me. It was just an age where you think about that. And it was also the first time I was aware of like calories and like I didn't have necessarily an eating disorder, but I had a really problematic relationship with food. And I began to see food as like good food, bad food. That weird relationship has continued into adulthood. So it's a really important time for I think a lot of people.
Yeah.
So what do you think are the common reasons for gay men who might experience an eating disorder? Like, what do you think are the things that lead to that?
Everything.
Everything about being gay. It really...
I mean, there might be, I'm jumping ahead to the trans section, but some form of body dysphoria or gender dysphoria. Also, I think when you learn to not like yourself or you never get validation for who you are, you probably don't validate the way you look.
It also talks a little bit about the connection between bullying,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like if you're bullied for being gay, I mean, and I remember having this thought was like, I was bullied for being gay and fat when I was 12. And I thought, well, I have control over the fat thing.
Yeah.
So I didn't want, I was like, oh, at least I'll be thin.
I mean, a lot of people think they have control over the gay thing, but
It's out of control.
I know we have to. We've planned an intervention.
This isn't, you're too gay. Happy Pride. But yeah, like, so there's that, there's PTSD, negative beliefs about yourself. Then also the one that I think I'm surprised we haven't talked about is the inability to meet body image ideals within our LGBTQ culture. We talked about this during the body image stuff.
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
like, there's high expectations out there. We have a sexualized culture that's really focused on appearance and you can't live up to that. I'm sure a lot of people really struggle with.
Yeah, I was trying to like talk about stuff that we've not already talked about
Yeah.
in our episode on body image and gay men.
Yeah. So the protective factors are a sense of connectedness to the gay community.
So the more you connect with the gay community,
The more you feel connected in part of the gay community, or you feel connected to other gay people, or you have a sense of the queer people around you.
that's interesting because I wonder what's the chicken and what's the egg. Like, do you feel more connected in the community because you already look a certain way so that you fit in? Because I saw the opposite. I saw that for queer women, being more connected with the community was a protective factor for eating disorder. But for gay men, the more like a gay man was connected to the scene, then it was a more of a chance that they would have more behaviors that are not great about eating.
That would make sense, and I guess really the nuance isn't there about what kind of gay community are we talking about. Because
Yeah,
if I'm going up to
exactly.
circuit parties, and that's my community of gay men, I'm not going to feel more comfortable about my body.
Unless you like kind of look like everyone who goes.
Yeah.
Like there are a ton of gay men who look like that. So then they would feel good.
But they could be really enforcing negative behaviors with them.
Yeah, yeah.
You also wrote about drug use to control appetite. So I'm just going to go on a limb here and talk about the fact that like I've had, because I use a stimulant drug, which I think most people who listen to this podcast are aware of by now. I use
Go
crystal-
back to season 2 if you don't know what we're talking about.
But shock and horror, I use crystal meth. It's a thing. But one of the things that I found was that my relationship with food when I was using crystal was like I would purge. My purge was using for 3 days, right? And then I would consume a lot of high calorie, high fat content food and not feel bad about it because I had starved myself for 3 days.
So you were doing like the purging before?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's just a weird thing that I was thinking about was like my relationship with food may not meet the DSM, but there was a weird element of control that was built into that. And I liked the fact that I could use the stimulant to like ward off excessive weight gain.
I've heard of people saying like, oh, I'm going to drink tonight, so I'm going to skip dinner.
Yeah. In my mind, it's not a good relationship to have with something that's so essential like eating and nourishment. Like it feels kind of dodgy. Lesbianism.
Yeah, so I researched for lesbian, and while for gay men the rate seemed higher than their straight counterpart, in the few studies that I found for lesbian, there was no significant difference in eating disorder in queer women and straight women. And that really reminds me of what Lauren and Amanda were saying in our episode on lesbian and body image, that sort of like the woman umbrella is just bigger than the queer umbrella, so that like queer women suffer from eating disorder sort of like same as straight women. So that doesn't mean that lesbians don't have an eating disorder. It just means that their rate of eating disorder is the same as straight women, which is like very different, because from what I've seen, women are like 3 to 4 times more likely to have an eating disorder than men. But again, men are underdiagnosed. And I saw research that said, and it made a lot of sense, but like that lesbian and like all queer people, the binging and the purging and the bulimia symptoms are not always for body, but sometimes it's for self-harm as well. And I find that the limit between what is an eating disorder and what is self-harm to be very thin. Because normally when people purge, at least, or fast, it's to sort of like punish themselves for something that they've done that they're uncomfortable with. And there's also trauma and minority stress and other mental health stuff. They also find out that bisexual women had a higher risk of having an eating disorder than lesbians, which kind of made sense if we think about the male gaze. And it would also be not wrong to assume that a lot of bisexual women are less present in the lesbian scene.
For a number of reasons. There's biphobia in our community, and they're not seen as really being queer, which is not a fair thing. Bisexual people are queer.
Also, I'm saying all of this, and in all the research that I've seen, the samples were very small. Yeah. Interestingly, it seemed like lesbian women have like a higher self-esteem in regard to their body and body satisfaction. Maybe not like a higher self-esteem across like everything, but like for body satisfaction and self-esteem, they sort of like scored higher. And they are less likely to have internalized like cultural standards for physical appearance. So they sort of like think outside the box physically more than bisexual and straight women. There's one article that I read that was really interesting. It was about like the role of like femme and butch in lesbian culture. Like we talked a little bit about this, which is not fully true, but there is still like that part of the culture, and obviously, femininity in our society is really linked with skinny,
Thin, petite.
yeah, especially in the white culture.
More research is needed again. Like we can't keep leaving women out of research.
Yeah,
And queer women especially.
I want to read the paper explaining why being part of the lesbian community is a protector, right?
The resilience factors.
Right?
this-
I want to read those research, but research loves pointing out at problems instead of pointing out at strength and solutions. Because the research we're saying like, oh, the rates are the same, but then being a lesbian is also a protective factor, and I'm like,
Contradiction.
which one is it? Right?
Either it's a protective factor or you're just the same level of risk. So
Yeah.
you can't have it both ways.
There was like a little bit more on the trans community than on lesbians, which was interesting. I'm assuming it's because as opposed to a lesbian, the rates of eating disorder amongst trans people are actually quite higher. So I'm assuming that this is why there's been maybe more research put into it. But I wonder how much of this research has actually been conducted and done like by trans people for trans people. I also found it hard when I was researching because when the research talk about trans people and eating disorder, they tend to like put everyone in the same bucket. And the experience of like someone assigned female at birth or someone assigned male at birth or non-binary or like trans men, trans women like would be, I want to assume, pretty different.
Yeah, I'm not surprised there's not a lot of nuance, but also like when it comes to, I think about research with trans bodies, especially people, but bodies.
Yeah.
Is there's a medicalized kind of obsession with controlling trans people in their bodies? Do you still have to have body dysmorphia to be considered for transitioning? Some form of body dysmorphia?
I think so. I think it's changing in Canada. The rate of eating disorder in the trans community, from what I've seen in research, are like really high. Like some of the research were like 75% of participants reported some experience of binging and purging. And it fits into the trans narrative that like trans kids are disturbed and like not doing well and have like other issues. So it kind of like fits into this narrative of almost like discrediting part of the trans experience by saying like, oh, it's other mental health issues. Maybe I'm like just really influenced by the anti-trans movement that's happening right now. But the numbers were pretty high. And these were not on like having a diagnosis, of course. Like it's probably extremely challenging for a trans person to get competent care for eating disorder as a trans person when they have a hard time getting competent care when they have a headache, right?
Yes.
So one thing that is for sure, and it's hard to like triage into everything, is that trans people tend, sort of like by definition, to have a lot of body dissatisfaction, at least pre-transition. And so when you can't control the way your body looks, a little bit like you said, like then I can control like my weight. At least this is one thing that like the whole world has been telling me that I have control over. One thing that I've seen in every paper, every article, like it was always there, and it always explained that for trans people, sometimes the eating control would serve to also control the way that their body looks. So that maybe trans women would want to control how they eat in order to attain that sort of like more skinny, like womanly figure. We also know that men and women don't always like have the fat accumulated in the same places. So one way to like sort of like deal with that is to have no fat. And then for trans men, they were saying that maybe controlling eating could prevent like curvier figure and like having breasts and things like that. Some trans men would also control their eating because if you push anorexia to a certain degree, it also blocks your periods.
Yeah. The one thing I'm thinking is that in puberty, if you don't have like, if your body isn't accumulating the calories it needs, can your body actually develop along the lines that it's meant to? Or maybe there seems to be some validity there.
And I couldn't see numbers anywhere. It was just like this anecdotal thing that was sort of like repeated over and over and over again. And like I said, the way that I read research is when something is repeated over and over and over again and does not necessarily like show me sources of where it comes from, then I'm like, oh, is everybody just like saying the same thing that they've read or they heard somewhere else?
And it becomes a truism.
Yeah, exactly, right? I'm sure some of it is true. I'm just suspicious of how much I've seen this particularly paragraph explained over and over again in almost exactly the same words everywhere.
That and the 42%. Which
The 42% was also like, hello.
check your sources, people.
Yeah.
Double check.
We talked about how hard it is for trans people to find like competent care. So finding like a therapist that is competent with trans stuff and also eating disorder and affordable, like that would just be like
That's a unicorn.
huge challenge. Yeah. There's also some trans people might have a hard time letting go of the eating disorder if it helps them pass. Both testosterone and estrogen can affect someone's weight. There's actually, when you Google, does this make me gain weight? Like replace like testosterone, estrogen, this table. I don't know. Like
Oxygen make me gain weight.
like you can Google that everywhere, but there's actually like quite a lot about estrogen and testosterone. Although anecdotally from the blogs I've read for this, a lot of people loved the hormone because it would change the place where fat is accumulated on the body.
Right.
Like the vast majority of trans folks who go through like affirming care or like hormone therapy or surgery, they are a lot happier and their gender dysphoria is a lot lower. But I didn't see, there was no like specific research saying like, and this impacts their eating disorder. We've already talked for so long.
For a very long time. It's been a longer episode than we're used to. This
Yeah.
would be heck to edit.
But treatment and resources, which was a very difficult section to write because 10 minutes at the end of my podcast, how am I supposed to truly support people with disordered eating? There are a lot of resources that I will put in the description of the episode. I will put stuff that is Canadian and Ontario based mostly. And I wanted in this section to like talk a little bit about me. And I discovered a podcast. It's a French podcast called On s'appelle et on déjeune. And to be honest, when my friend told me about this podcast and I discovered it, I felt like I had come such a long way and I was feeling so much better about my body. Like I was no longer having the bad behavior from like when I was a teenager or like in my early 20s or blah, blah. But part of me was fully tuning into this podcast for nutritional advice on how to lose weight because my brain always went there.
Right.
But instead, it made me sort of like more and more intrigued about anti-fat biases. And then after it got me interested, they referred to a few books, like the Anti-Diet book from Christy Harrison and the Intuitive Eating book, which I recommend. Both books, they're really good. And the two books from Aubrey Gordon too, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, and the one she just published that I haven't read yet, full disclosure, which is You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People. Her books are pretty like starter level. And so for this section, I wanted to focus on intuitive eating because for me, it was really a big part of my journey. And intuitive eating is based on 10 principles. They're really clear about the fact that they're principles and they're not rules because they say as soon as you start having rules about the way you eat, that's a diet. Right? And they're like, these are principles, they're ideas, they're not things that you have to absolutely do all the time. They're just like ways to look at food differently. I'm not going to go through 10 principles because like first that's a ripoff from their work and then also we don't have that kind of time. But I'll focus on 3 where like I think they're like good place to start. And the first is reject the diet mentality. Jordan,
What does that mean to me?
what does that mean to you, Jordan?
I cheated because I read your notes, but I actually was reading your notes because I thought there's a lot of commonality. We talked about this in the podcast, that people believe being fat is the worst thing possible, right? And like that's a thing that I've struggled with, is that like I don't want to gain weight, right? It's a thing that I just am afraid of doing. But rejecting that principle that like being fat is the worst thing possible, or gaining weight is the worst thing possible, is one thing. And the other thing it says to me is what we talked about on the podcast in the first part of the series, which is understanding that diet culture and the science of dieting is hooey. It's a bunch of malarkey.
Yeah, it's like being fat's not the worst thing possible, and also diets don't work the way that diets keeps telling us that they work. Like you can reject that, and a lot of people, including myself, were so like stuck in between those two ideas of like, I want to heal my relationship with food unless it means that I'm gonna gain weight.
Yes.
It's really hard to let go of that. The second one is feel your fullness. Feel your fullness.
I won't even tell you what I thought when I first said this. I was just like, ooh, look, it just felt like, oh, you feel voluptuous and curvy, which is not what it is.
Feel your, oh yeah, like, ooh, I'm feeling my fullness today. I love this.
I think it's about registering when you're actually full in your body. This is something I don't do at all. I eat like an automaton, whether I'm full or not. I just continue to eat and show food into my body. And I never often stop to think, like, am I actually hungry? I mean, we never talked about emotional eating, which is a thing. We
True.
talked about it, but for me, it's like, am I eating because I'm hungry, or am I eating because I am feeling depressed today and I can't do this, so I'm going to do this? So, but like, it's about, you know, listening to your body, listening to when you're full.
Yeah. To be fair, one of the principle is deal with your emotions, which I find is one of the weakest part of the book, because I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna deal with my feelings.
Oh, it's so easy. Oh, I never thought
yeah. It's like, go to therapy, and I'm like, as a therapist, I can assure you that dealing with your feelings is not as easy as just like going to yeah, exactly. It helps if you have a good therapist.
But it's aware that you have a feeling sometimes, because I don't.
Yeah.
So, just,
but yeah, feeling your fullness is just to reconnect with your body when you feel full, and with this sort of like sense that if you're hungry again, you can eat again later, so you don't have to stuff yourself. Intuitive eating, one of the biggest flaw is that it operates with the idea that everybody always has access to like an array of various food at the tip of their fingers. That they don't have to cook, that they don't have to do dishes all the time. Like sometimes I eat stuff because that's what's in my fridge right now.
Yeah. That's basically the decision I make.
Yeah. Feeling your fullness is also really hard for people who work, like in between meetings. Like I used to do that a lot. It never worked. It was so gross. But like, oh, this is the 20-minute I have for eating, and I know I'm always like starving in the afternoon. So I'm like eating this giant portion of lunch because I won't have time later to come back and eat the second half of my lunch, which I think ideally is what I would like to do, but like that's not always a thing that's possible. So I'm like gonna try to like stuff myself up because I know I'm not gonna be able to eat for a long time. Ideally, that's not like great with healing your relationship with food, but I understand why people do that because life is stressful.
And we don't make time though in our lives to actually sit down and appreciate our meal and to eat slowly.
And the last one is a principle that's called challenge the food police.
I like challenging police, period. So, defund the food police. I'm guessing that is like the people in our lives and the messages in our lives that tell us the unhealthy things and the helpful things about food. Like I think about all the people that talk about clean eating and like the whole keto, no carb, no this, no that, like not listening to them anymore and giving them more validity. I would also say it's like the friends and family members or the people that make comments about what you're eating, or like who make the jokes about people's body image and weight. Like those are food police too.
Yeah.
Like just ictionate on that behavior. No thanks. If you're having lunch with me, don't be making fun of people's weight. Or telling me that I cannot eat that pasta carbonara because you are not a cool person.
Yeah. In the context of intuitive eating, the food police is really like just the voice that you have internalized, because it's not always safe to be telling people, don't talk to me about your keto diet, don't talk to me about not liking potatoes. Like,
no, That's why I have no friends.
Yeah.
But you're right. There's a time and a place for that. But internalized messages, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The food police is like really intense. Once you start hearing it, you hear it everywhere. And I have an anecdote for that where I went to a restaurant the other day. And to be fair, this restaurant serves pretty healthy sizing. But the person behind me that I actually never saw because they were sitting behind me, but received their plate and commented nonstop about how much potatoes they were on the plate and how much they could never eat that many potatoes. And like, that was way too many potatoes for one person to eat. And like, it was very clear that they wanted to, the waiter and the person that they were sitting with and sort of like bystanders, that there is no way that this person would eat that many potatoes. Like, and I'm like, yeah, this restaurant serves a lot of potatoes, right? But like, eat what you want to eat and leave the rest behind.
How much of that is about signaling, like, I'm concerned with my health, or like, I'm like trying to present myself in a way that's like, oh, I'm controlling my money, aren't I virtuous by that?
And I don't think this person was doing anything wrong per se. Like, I don't want to like shit on them, but like, it's just like, that's the food police to me. Like, I don't think they were like conscious about virtue signaling about not eating potatoes. I think it was just like a natural sort of like fear response to food that we've learned to have in public like all the time.
Mm-hmm. But we look at it as quite normal.
Yeah. The food noise is everywhere, and once you start challenging it, like it, not that it ruins your life, but like you really start hearing it all the time. It's really annoying.
If you have too many potatoes on your plate, please contact me.
Yeah.
I will eat the potatoes, especially if they're in French fry form, and I will help you.
Yeah. If you have too many potatoes, eat what you feel like eating and then ask for like a container so that later in the day you can have more potatoes.
Or you can give it to me.
Yeah. Or Jordan. I guess like the goal of all of this is to heal our relationship with food. Mm-hmm. And just by hearing me talk about those three concepts, you've probably not healed your relationship with food. I'm assuming you, and I'm assuming people at home. But people are always afraid that like, if I challenge the food police or if I learn to do those things, then all I'll do is eat cake all day. Mm-hmm. And like, eating cake all day is not healing your relationship with food. Eating cake when you want to eat cake is healing your relationship with food. Like, it's kind of subtle, and to be honest, I went into the other extreme where a lot of people who learn about intuitive eating, at first they're just like, I can eat whatever I want whenever I want, which is not what this says. Mm-hmm. It was useful for me to like fully balance into the other side, but it's quite tough to heal your relationship with food.
Mm-hmm. The enormity of that task is kind of making itself apparent right now. I'm having a bit of a moment in my head right now, folks, which is why I'm looking melancholy. I was thinking about the 6 donuts I ate yesterday. And I was thinking about what led to that moment where I did essentially eat cake all day. Like, I had donuts in the morning and donuts for lunch because I thought about what was accessible to me in my fridge and all these other things that came into play that made that decision possible for me, and then how badly I felt about it afterwards because I let the tape go on in my head.
Yeah.
Like, it's a really complex relationship.
Yeah. And I think it's still okay for you to think like, oh, eating 6 donuts for dinner is not what I want to do every dinner.
No, I don't really want to do it for every dinner.
Right. And that's not necessarily like you being on a diet, just saying like, acknowledging like, oh, like this was not the nutrition I want to have all the time. And like, kind of do whatever you want. Like, you can listen to this whole podcast and decide like, I don't want to change my relationship with food, and like, good for you. Like, that's fine. But
don't feed into it.
Yeah. And like, I was fully potato person not so long ago.
We've all been potato people.
Yeah.
That's an interesting place to leave the podcast.
Well, it's the perfect place to leave the podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you are looking at the video, do not hesitate to give us a rating or a comment and to subscribe to this podcast. And I guess now you can subscribe to this YouTube channel with one video in it.
This is the greatest YouTube content I think has ever been posted out there. I'm excited for the doors this is going to open for us.
If you want to stay in contact with Jordan, it's at Blood and Gore, GORR, on Instagram. And for me, you follow the at Mental Health Much Instagram account as well. Until the next episode, please keep talking about mental health as much as possible and keep safe.